My husband, Jake, and I have been together for almost 8 years. We have a happy marriage, but there are constant conflicts with his parents. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law, Linda, disliked me from the very beginning. My father-in-law, Bill, was a kind man, but he always let his wife take charge and preferred to stay out of conflicts. Jake grew up in a wealthier family compared to mine, and Linda always seemed to see that as a problem. From day one, she made it clear that coming from a middle-class family was some sort of flaw. She would make comments about my appearance, my clothes, or even my shoes. I had always felt confident in how I dressed, making sure I was appropriate for every situation, but that was never enough. Because of her constant remarks, I started buying expensive clothes just for meetings with her so she wouldn't look down on me. One day, I wore a white blouse she had seen me in the month before, and she immediately pointed out that I was repeating outfits, adding that wealthy people don't do that. With a sneer, she told me I should be ashamed. Jake tried to shut her down, but Linda always made sure to humiliate me in front of others, making it impossible to avoid embarrassment. She even dragged me on shopping trips and bought me clothes I didn't even like. Still, I accepted them with gratitude, foolishly hoping that she would eventually warm up to me. But things only got worse. It became clear that her so-called generosity came with conditions. When Jake and I had been dating for less than a year, I landed a job at a great company, which significantly improved my lifestyle. Jake was thrilled for me, but Linda? She was furious. She started calling and messaging me, demanding to know exactly how much I earned. According to her, women in their family should always make less than their husbands. I was beyond insulted and pointed out that, in the long run, I'd probably out-earn Jake because the pharmaceutical industry is incredibly lucrative. That set her off. She insisted that I could work in that field before marriage, but once we were wed, I'd have to quit. Apparently, she didn't want people thinking Jake couldn't provide for his family. I laughed in her face. What was this, the 1950s? Jake had never had a problem with my job or my income. I decided to confront him about how his mother was making me feel. He was furious that she had been calling and harassing me over this. I don't know what he said to her, but soon after, she called me, crying and screaming, accusing me of trying to turn her son against her. She called me the devil and swore she'd never let Jake marry a woman like me. She told me to leave him. I hung up and blocked her. Her toxicity was exhausting, and this was the first real warning sign that things would never get better. Of course, Jake and I didn't break up, but it made me think hard about the kind of woman who had raised him. Unfortunately, I couldn't cut Linda out completely. I still had to attend family events where she would be present. She completely ignored me, acting as if I didn't exist. At Jake's cousin's birthday party, for example, everyone greeted us both, but she ran straight past me to hug Jake, asking how his day was. If he tried to bring me into the conversation, she would look away and change the subject. I started noticing a pattern. She always played up her supposed health problems, constantly telling Jake how old and weak she was getting, as if she might drop dead any moment. The woman was in perfect health. It was just another way to manipulate him into giving her more attention. Years later, when Jake proposed, he invited both of our families to the engagement party. My parents and grandparents were overjoyed, but I can't say the same for his. Linda showed up with a scowl that only deepened when she saw the ring on my hand. She immediately started complaining to Jake about how disrespectful it was that he bought me a ring bigger than the one Bill had given her. Bill tried to calm her down, urging her not to make a scene, but she wouldn't stop. She ranted about how Jake never did anything good for her, but was willing to go all out for this poor little girl. That was it. I snapped. I told her that if she couldn't respect me, she could leave. Linda was stunned by what I had said, but I knew I wasn't going to let her ruin the happiest day of my life in front of my entire family. Bill escorted her out of the room while she kept yelling something at Jake. Later, she called him to apologize, claiming she had been drunk, even though we all knew she had barely had a single glass of wine. But since she technically apologized to both of us, we decided to let it go. Then came the wedding preparations. Linda insisted on being involved in choosing my wedding dress, saying she had always dreamed of this moment. By that point, my patience with her was running dangerously low, but she was still my fiancé's mother, and I couldn't openly disrespect her. So, I agreed to take her along. I warned my mom and my sister to brace themselves for whatever nonsense she might pull. As expected, she found something to criticize immediately. She told me that sophisticated women don't wear so much lace and demanded that I pick a more traditional plain white gown. I refused. My mother firmly told her that I wasn't her daughter, so maybe she should keep her opinions to herself. Linda got furious and pouted in the corner like a child, arms crossed, sulking through the entire dress fitting. She kept making snide remarks about every dress I tried on, but I ignored her. Eventually, I found the perfect dress and paid for it. That's when she walked up to me, smiled, and said, "I'm glad you chose this one. It makes your arms look fat," then laughed. That was it. My mother, who had been patient beyond belief, finally snapped and started yelling at her for her childish and nasty behavior. I was on the verge of tears, because who the hell wants to hear something like that about their wedding dress? Especially when I wasn't even remotely overweight. I had no idea why she would say such a thing, other than pure malice. I decided I wasn't giving her a ride home. I had been driving everyone that day, but there was no way I was going to let her sit in my car and keep spewing insults. When I told her she'd have to find her own way back, she panicked. She insisted that I couldn't just abandon her like that. But that's exactly what I did. On the way home, my phone rang. It was Jake. He was upset, asking how I could leave his mother stranded like that. Apparently, she had called him in tears, claiming I had cruelly left her behind on purpose. I told him I'd explain everything when I got home, but he kept pressing me. That's when my mom, who had been listening to the conversation on speaker, stepped in. She told Jake he had no idea how his mother had behaved all day. She listed out every single thing Linda had done, ending with, "Do you really think that's how an adult woman should act?" Jake went quiet. He was clearly embarrassed. He had only heard his mother's version of events, not the truth. Of course, Linda hadn't told him the full story. Later, when Jake got home, he apologized. He said he had panicked, thinking his elderly mother was left alone, which is why he reacted the way he did. I told him I would never have done that if she hadn't acted like a total nightmare the entire day. Jake hugged me and said he'd understand if I wanted to remove her from the wedding guest list. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to do just that. But I worried that Bill wouldn't be able to attend if Linda wasn't invited. She wouldn't allow it. And I didn't want Jake's father to miss our wedding because of her. So we decided to talk to Bill beforehand. We told him that if Linda started acting up, he would need to take her out immediately. He understood completely and assured us that he knew exactly what we were dealing with. Honestly, I felt bad for Bill. He had to put up with her 24/7. On the wedding day, to everyone's surprise, Linda behaved. She spent most of the time bragging about how grand our ceremony was, as if she had contributed in any way. In reality, everything had been paid for out of our own wedding fund. But since Jake's family was wealthy and Linda loved exaggerating, a lot of the guests assumed that she and Bill had covered the expenses. During the speeches, however, Bill made it very clear that they hadn't paid a single cent and that the entire wedding was thanks to our own hard work. He also mentioned how proud he was to have such a smart and capable daughter-in-law, saying he never imagined his son would be lucky enough to find someone like me. After that, guests kept congratulating us, surprised that we had managed to pay for everything on our own. Linda's face darkened more and more. She was furious with Bill. Then came the father-daughter dance. My dad and I took the floor to applause from the guests. Jake was about to step in for our turn when, suddenly, Linda rushed over and announced that she should be the first woman to dance with her baby boy. Jake agreed, and they had their dance. Later, as the wedding was winding down, Linda approached me. She congratulated me, and I smiled politely. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "I was wrong. I guess your arms don't look that fat in that dress after all." Then she walked away like nothing had happened. It pissed me off, but I refused to let her ruin my perfect day with her petty remarks. Everyone had a great time. We danced until late at night, and honestly, we might have gone a little overboard with the drinks. The next morning, I woke up to several messages from Linda. Imagine my shock when I read them. She claimed that I had embarrassed her throughout the entire wedding, and that I needed to do better if I wanted to be part of her family. My head was still a little sore from the celebrations, but I clearly remembered everything from the wedding. Just to be sure, I called my parents and asked if I had done anything inappropriate. They reassured me that I had behaved just fine and that everyone had a fantastic time. Later, when Jake woke up, I showed him the messages. He told me to ignore them. That response made me suspicious, so I pressed him to explain what exactly his mother was referring to. That's when Jake admitted that throughout the entire night, Linda had been approaching him, whispering that I was having too much fun. Apparently, whenever I danced with my cousins, she would call me inappropriate and tell Jake that he needed to keep me under control, because I was a married woman now. Jake laughed it off as he told me, saying he ignored her comments and that I should do the same. But I wasn't amused. How dare she imply something so disgusting when I was just dancing with my own family at my own wedding? She had no right to talk about me like that. I wanted to confront her immediately, but we were about to leave for our honeymoon, so I decided to deal with it later. Our honeymoon was amazing. We had the best time together. On the day we returned, Linda called me out of the blue, her voice overly sweet as she asked how everything had been. It was odd, considering she almost never called me directly. I told her plainly that I didn't appreciate the way she had spoken about me to Jake on our wedding night. She quickly dismissed it, claiming she didn't mean anything by it. Then she started asking for details about our honeymoon, repeatedly hinting at whether we had spent enough alone time together. I finally asked her to speak plainly because our honeymoon was none of her business. That's when she outright asked if I was planning to have a baby soon. I nearly gagged. For two reasons. First, I had literally just gotten married. Not even a week had passed, and she was already expecting me to start popping out grandkids for her. Second, Jake and I had already decided long ago that we weren't in a rush to have children. We had talked about this well before our relationship got serious, and our feelings hadn't changed. I stayed silent as she kept pushing, saying I needed to get pregnant as soon as possible because my biological clock was ticking, and these were my best years to have children. I was so uncomfortable listening to her ramble that I could barely keep my composure. But then she crossed a line. She outright told me that Jake and I needed to stop using contraception. That was it. I immediately shut her down, telling her I was done with this conversation. When I told Jake, he was furious. He called her right away and told her exactly what he thought of her behavior. He also made it clear that we weren't planning on having kids anytime soon. Linda's reaction was predictable. She started screaming like we had just killed her dog. Then came the threats. She told Jake that if he didn't give her a grandchild, she would cut him out of her will. Jake burst out laughing. He reminded her that she didn't own anything. She and Bill had a prenup, and she had no assets to leave behind. That's when Linda turned on me. She started yelling that it was all my fault, that my only purpose as a woman was to bear children for my husband, and that I was failing at even that. She started hurling insults, calling me useless and selfish, making it sound like we had personally shattered her life stream. She went on a tirade about how if we weren't going to have kids, then why did we even bother getting married? That was the final straw for Jake. He cut her off mid-rant and told her he had had enough. He made it crystal clear that he would no longer tolerate her behavior. After years of her humiliation and cruelty, he was done. Linda tried to backtrack, but Jake was firm. He told her that he was cutting her out of his life completely. She was no longer welcome in our home or in our lives. And if she ever showed up uninvited, we would call the cops and make sure the whole neighborhood saw her getting escorted away. Knowing how much she cared about appearances, that hit her hard. Since then, we have kept our word and completely cut her off. Bill tried to intervene once, but after talking to Jake and hearing the full story, he sided with us. She walked away as if nothing had happened. It infuriated me, but I refused to let her bitterness ruin my perfect day. Everyone had a great time. We danced until late at night, and maybe even overdid it with the drinks. The next morning, I woke up to several messages from Linda. I felt my stomach drop as I read them. According to her, I had humiliated her throughout the entire wedding, and if I wanted to be part of her family, I needed to do better. My head was still pounding from the celebrations, but I clearly remembered everything that had happened. Just to be sure, I called my parents to ask if I had done anything embarrassing. They reassured me that I had been perfectly fine and that everyone had an amazing time. When Jake woke up, I showed him the messages. He told me to ignore them, but something about the way he said it made me suspicious. I pressed him to tell me what exactly she was talking about. That's when he admitted that Linda had spent the entire night pulling him aside, whispering that I was having too much fun. Every time I danced with my cousins, she accused me of being inappropriate and told Jake that he needed to keep me in check now that I was married. Jake laughed as he told me, brushing it off, saying he ignored her and that I should do the same. But I wasn't laughing. How dare she imply something so disgusting when I was simply enjoying my own wedding? She had no right to talk about me like that. I wanted to confront her immediately, but we were leaving for our honeymoon, so I decided to deal with it later. The honeymoon was perfect. We had an incredible time. On the day we returned, Linda called me out of nowhere. Her voice was sickly sweet as she asked how everything had been. It was strange because she almost never called me. I took the opportunity to tell her directly that I didn't appreciate what she had said to Jake at our wedding. She brushed it off, claiming she didn't mean anything by it. Then she started asking about our honeymoon, her questions laced with heavy hints about whether we had spent enough alone time together. I finally asked her to speak plainly because our honeymoon was none of her business. That's when she outright asked if I was planning on having a baby soon. I nearly gagged. First, I had barely been married a week, and she was already expecting me to start producing grandchildren for her. Second, Jake and I had long ago decided we weren't in a rush to have kids. We had discussed it well before we got serious, and nothing had changed. I stayed silent as she kept pushing, saying I needed to get pregnant as soon as possible because my biological clock was ticking, and these were my best years for motherhood. I was so uncomfortable I could barely keep my composure. But then she went even further. She told me that Jake and I needed to stop using contraception. That was it. I cut her off immediately and told her I was done with this conversation. When I told Jake, he was livid. He called her right away, telling her exactly what he thought of her behavior. He also made it clear that we weren't planning on having kids anytime soon. Her reaction was predictable. She started screaming like we had committed some unforgivable crime. Then came the threats. She told Jake that if he didn't give her a grandchild, she would cut him out of her will. Jake laughed in her face. He reminded her that she didn't own anything. She and Bill had a prenup, so she had no assets to leave behind. That's when she turned on me. She accused me of ruining everything, saying that my only purpose as a woman was to give my husband children, and that I was failing at even that. She hurled insult after insult, making it sound like we had personally destroyed her life's purpose. She ranted about how if we weren't going to have kids, then why did we even bother getting married? That was the final straw for Jake. He told her he was done. He made it clear that he would no longer tolerate her behavior. After years of humiliation and cruelty, he was finished. Linda tried to backtrack, but Jake was firm. He told her she was no longer welcome in our home or in our lives. And if she ever showed up uninvited, we would call the cops and make sure the entire neighborhood saw her getting escorted away. Knowing how much she cared about appearances, that shut her up. Since then, we've kept our word. We completely cut her off. Bill tried to intervene once, but after talking to Jake and hearing the full truth, he sided with us. Over time, my parents and Bill met up frequently, but we never invited Linda. Thankfully, she respected our boundaries. Then, last December, I accidentally got pregnant. We were shocked. It wasn't planned, but we were in a good place in life, so we decided to embrace it. When we shared the news, our loved ones celebrated with us. Even Linda sent a bouquet and a letter filled with apologies. She wrote that she had spent years in therapy and realized how horribly she had behaved. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to believe she had changed. Then, 2 months into the pregnancy, I lost the baby. It happened in the middle of the night. I froze when I saw the blood. I woke Jake up in tears, and he rushed me to the nearest hospital. The news was devastating. Even though we hadn't planned for this baby, we had already fallen in love with them. We would have done anything for them. I didn't know how to cope with the grief. Jake and my parents were my rock. Bill and Jake's family called to check in and even visited. My mom moved in with us for a few days because she knew I was too broken to even get out of bed. I hurt in ways I didn't think were possible. I spent hours crying. Jake held me through it all, and step by step, I started to heal. Then, last week, Bill invited us to his and Linda's 25th wedding anniversary. It was a big family event. Everyone was invited. Jake and I didn't want to go. We knew the topic of the miscarriage would come up, and it was too painful to discuss. But Bill begged us, saying he just wanted to spend time with us and that we deserved a night to relax. We reluctantly agreed. This would be our first time seeing Linda in years. But I was already emotionally drained. I didn't have the energy to worry about her. Linda was pleasantly surprised to see Jake and immediately pulled him into a hug. With me, she was cold, but I didn't care. I found a seat and let Jake deal with her. During dinner, everyone shared their good news and successes, as they usually did at family events. Then, one of Jake's cousins announced her pregnancy. It felt like a punch to the gut. Everyone congratulated her. Then, Linda stood up to give a toast. She raised her glass and started talking about how grateful she was for family and how she wouldn't change a thing. Then she congratulated the cousin, calling her baby a precious gift to the world. And then she said it. Unlike others, who murder their children. She looked directly at me. Jake and I froze. She kept going, loudly accusing me of doing something to cause the miscarriage because miscarriages don't just happen. She ranted about how she only let Jake marry me because she hoped for grandchildren, but I had failed at even that. Then, she lifted her glass and downed her drink like she had just delivered a victorious speech. Silence. Jake finally snapped, demanding to know what the hell she was doing. They started arguing, her throwing accusations while he defended me. I was too shattered to even respond. I burst into tears. Linda scoffed and told me to stop putting on a show because no one would believe my sob story. Then, out of nowhere, Bill stood up. He told everyone to calm down. He had something important to say. He said he had spent the last 25 years suffering. And tonight, his eyes were finally open. He turned to Linda and announced that there wouldn't be another anniversary, because he no longer wanted to be married to her. Linda looked absolutely stunned. Bill didn't ask the guests to leave. He simply told everyone to enjoy their meal and announced that he was stepping out for a drink. He took off his jacket and tie and walked out of the party. Linda screamed after him, demanding he come back, but he ignored her. Then, she turned her rage toward me. She pointed a finger at me and accused me of ruining everything. She blamed me for the downfall of her marriage, claiming that I had destroyed her life. But Jake didn't let that slide. He told her, loud and clear, that she had no one to blame but herself. He said he was happy his father was finally walking away from her. That must have hit her hard because, for the first time in years, she went silent. Then, with a huff, she announced that she was leaving as well. Some guests came over to check if I was okay. Jake's pregnant cousin even hugged me, offering quiet support. After that night, Bill moved in with us. He flat out refused to go back home, despite Linda calling him dozens of times a day. He told us he was going to meet with a divorce attorney. I felt awful. I knew logically that this wasn't my fault, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in some way, I was responsible for what was happening. Was I really to blame for Bill divorcing Jake's mother? Update 1. I never expected my story to get such a huge response. When I posted it, I was just looking for some perspective. I was overwhelmed by the number of people who shared their own experiences with toxic in-laws. It's shocking how common this is. I also want to clarify, please don't blame my husband. Jake stood up for me every single time. It hasn't been easy for him to deal with a controlling, manipulative, and toxic mother. I was lucky to grow up in a loving family, but he wasn't. He grew up thinking this was normal. And yet, he did everything in his power to protect me. I also want to thank everyone who shared their stories about miscarriage. My heart goes out to every woman who has gone through this. It's hard to admit, but I feel an immense amount of guilt. I know logically that I did everything I could, but I can't shake the feeling that I failed. I'm taking your advice. I've reached out to a therapist, and I'm also joining forums where women share their experiences and support each other. Update 2. Bill officially filed for divorce. It's been 2 months since my last update, and Bill has been living with us the entire time. Honestly, he's a great house guest. Now I see where Jake got his sense of humor. Bill also loves to cook, so sometimes I come home to a fully prepared meal. Linda never deserved him. I don't understand how she let such a good man slip away. When Bill and Jake went to serve her the divorce papers, she refused to even look at them. Jake told me that she screamed at them, claiming they had no right to cast her aside. She even tried to excuse her horrible words at the anniversary, saying she only said those things because she wanted the best for our family. Jake ignored her and helped Bill pack his things. That's when Linda completely lost it. She started throwing things, screaming and cursing. At that point, Bill calmly told her that if she didn't stop, he would call the police. That shut her up fast. She knew she had nowhere to go. After the anniversary disaster, no one from the family wanted anything to do with her. No one reached out except to tell her how awful she had been. Everyone knew she had lied about me being a trophy wife. They knew I had a great career and a solid income. They also understood how painful my miscarriage had been. People made it clear they wanted nothing to do with her. Now, she has no family. No friends. She did this to herself. She's been begging Bill to take her back, but he's done. My parents even had a conversation with her after they found out what she had said to me. They made it clear that if she kept spreading lies, they would sue her for defamation. My mom doesn't play around. I know my parents well enough to know that if it comes to that, they will absolutely follow through. I just hope she stays away from me. Update 3. Thank you to everyone who has supported me on this journey. It's been 8 months since my last update, and I wanted to let you all know Bill is officially a free man. Because of the prenup, Linda wasn't entitled to anything. But Bill, being the kind-hearted man he is, still gave her all the money from their joint account and left her with their car. She was furious. She demanded the house, too. Bill and his lawyer just laughed. He had owned the house long before they got married. Jake heard that his mother is now staying with one of his cousins while she looks for a more affordable place to live. Personally, I think she has enough money to live comfortably on her own. She mostly stays out of our lives now. But every once in a while, we hear that she's still trying to spin her own version of the story, hoping to get sympathy. Well, let her try. As for us, we're happy. Jake and I are doing great. I did go to therapy, as I mentioned before, and it helped me a lot. I even made new friends, people who truly understand what I've been through. Jake also started therapy. He's working through a lot of things from his past. Career-wise, we're both thriving. And most importantly, we're just grateful for the life we have now.